Multiple ballistic missiles arc toward a runway in the Jordanian desert, toward a base that houses American F-35s, toward American troops standing watch on the ground below. Every one of them gets shot down. That is the headline United States Central Command wants the world to read. But behind that clean, reassuring sentence sits a number nobody in an official statement is saying out loud, and it may be the most important number in this entire war right now. The interceptor missiles doing the shooting down are running out. Read that again, because that sentence is doing more work than it looks like it's doing. This is not a story about whether Iran can hit an American base. Every missile fired at Muwaffaq Salti Air Base was intercepted, exactly as CENTCOM said. This is a story about how many more times that sentence can be true before the math runs out from underneath it. And on the very same day that missile barrage happened, the President of the United States was standing in the Oval Office with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the middle of what both governments had been quietly calling the most promising diplomatic window in weeks. Understanding how those two facts, a missile attack timed to a diplomatic meeting and a defensive shield running low on ammunition, fit together, is the entire story of where this war stands right now. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why Tuesday's attack landed the way it did, you need to understand exactly what the days before it looked like. Earlier this month, the Memorandum of Understanding that had briefly reopened the Strait of Hormuz collapsed, and the United States responded with nearly 2 straight weeks of consecutive airstrikes against Iran, a campaign that ran 13 nights, hit more than 300 targets in its opening 3 nights alone, and struck roughly 140 targets in a single evening at its peak. Iran answered in kind, launching drone and missile attacks against every Gulf state hosting American forces. On July 17th, an Iranian missile and drone barrage against that same airbase in Jordan killed American service members, the first fatalities from direct Iranian fire since the earliest days of this war. That 13-night exchange finally went quiet on a Friday. A pause the president described as coming at Iran's own request, tied to what he called very good ongoing talks. For 5 nights, the longest lull this war had produced since the current phase began, nothing happened. Then Tuesday arrived, and the quiet ended in the same place it had ended before. At 5:45 in the afternoon Eastern Time, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran in what CENTCOM called an attempted surprise attack on American forces in the Middle East. Every missile was intercepted. American forces remained, in CENTCOM's own words, vigilant and at a high state of readiness. At least 3 of those missiles struck directly at Muwaffaq Salti Air Base. Footage circulating within hours, showing impacts on the facility itself, even as the interception message was going out publicly. Iran's foreign ministry response arrived almost as fast as the missiles did. Spokesperson Esmail Baghei told reporters that what existed before Tuesday could not accurately be called a ceasefire in the first place. A carefully worded statement that lets Tehran claim it never actually broke an agreement it insists never formally existed. Now let's dissect exactly what happened in the hours around that attack, because the timing is not incidental. Hours before the missiles launched, Trump had been sitting across from Netanyahu at the White House, a meeting focused heavily on Iran, part of the same diplomatic track that had produced the 5-night pause in the first place. An Iranian ballistic missile barrage landing on American forces in the middle of that exact meeting is either a remarkable coincidence or a deliberate message. The pattern of this war, so far, does not favor coincidence. Every previous lull in this conflict, the June memorandum, the earlier April ultimatum window, the brief calm that preceded this most recent pause, has ended the same way, with an Iranian strike landing at the exact moment American and Allied diplomacy appeared to be making progress. That is either the Guard Corps signaling that it does not answer to whatever Iran's civilian negotiators are agreeing to in Washington, or it is Tehran's actual negotiating strategy, applying pressure at the precise moment leverage matters most. Both explanations point toward the same underlying problem this war keeps running into: a gap between what Iran's diplomats say in a room in Washington and what Iran's military does the same week back home. And here is where it gets significantly worse than the clean CENTCOM statement lets on. According to reporting citing an anonymous American official, the interceptor stockpiles behind that all-clear message are dangerously depleted after 5 months of continuous fighting. So depleted that the same official says American forces are now deliberately allowing some incoming Iranian missiles through defended airspace rather than firing an interceptor at every single one. Read that carefully, because it reframes everything about how this war is actually being fought right now. Patriot and THAAD batteries are not unlimited magazines. Every intercept, successful or not, consumes a missile that costs millions of dollars and takes real time to manufacture and ship into theater. And a campaign that has now run continuous high-intensity air defense operations across multiple Gulf states for 5 months is a campaign that has been drawing down that inventory every single night, whether or not any individual night makes headlines. A defended perimeter that quietly allows some threats through by deliberate choice, rather than catching every single one by capability, is a fundamentally different security posture than the one CENTCOM's public statements describe. And it is the kind of detail a government has every reason to keep out of its own press releases for as long as it possibly can. That detail connects directly to the broader campaign that produced this moment in the first place, because the 13-night strike run leading up to this pause was not simply about degrading Iran's missile forces in the abstract. It was aimed specifically at the underground infrastructure that keeps producing the exact threat now straining American interceptor stocks. That campaign leaned heavily on a 5,000-pound bunkerbuster bomb called the GBU-72, employed in combat for the first time this year, built specifically to punch through roughly 100 feet of earth and more than 20 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating below the surface. Only 2 aircraft in the entire American inventory are cleared to carry it, the B-1B Lancer and the F-15E Strike Eagle, a genuinely short list given how large the American combat aircraft fleet actually is. The B-1B in particular has become the workhorse of this specific campaign, capable of carrying more than 75,000 pounds of ordnance across 3 internal weapons bays, flown in the campaign's opening phase on missions that launched from the continental United States, crossed the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, struck targets inside Iran, and returned home on multiple aerial refuelings, all before Britain had even cleared the use of its own air bases for the operation. That refusal did not last. Within roughly a day of an Iranian drone striking near a Royal Air Force base on Cyprus, London reversed course and opened RAF Fairford to American B-1 operations, a striking illustration of how quickly this war has been able to reshape decisions in Allied capitals that had been reluctant to get directly involved. The reason all of that matters to Tuesday's missile attack is straightforward. The GBU-72 campaign was aimed squarely at eliminating the underground missile storage and launch infrastructure Iran has spent years building specifically to survive exactly this kind of bombardment. The same infrastructure that keeps generating the ballistic missile barrages American Patriot and Theody batteries then have to shoot down on the other end. Degrading the launch sites and degrading the interceptor stockpile are 2 sides of the same operational equation. And right now, the American side of that equation is under more strain than the confident tone of CENTCOM's public messaging lets on. Every bunker the bombing campaign successfully destroys is one less source of future missiles. But every missile that does get launched before that campaign finishes, the job draws down an interceptor inventory that a 5-month war has already stretched thin, which is precisely why the pause itself, 5 days of quiet before Tuesday's attack, may have mattered as much for American logistics and resupply as it did for any actual diplomatic breakthrough. Now, for the mechanics of what an interceptor shortage actually does to a battlefield, because this is the part that deserves real analysis rather than headline treatment. A Patriot battery does not fire indiscriminately at every radar contact. It prioritizes threats based on trajectory, target value, and remaining inventory, and an operator working with a depleted magazine has to make harder calls about which incoming missile gets an interceptor and which one gets accepted as risk. Theod operates at a different altitude band, specifically to catch missiles a Patriot system might miss, giving American forces a layered defense architecture similar in concept to what Ukraine has built against Russian missiles further north, multiple systems positioned to catch what the previous layer failed to stop. That layered approach only works as designed when every layer still has ammunition to fire. A structural shortage forces harder trade-offs across the entire stack, not just at any single battery. And it explains why an anonymous official would choose to reveal this detail now, rather than let the public keep assuming every single Iranian missile gets caught by capability, rather than by a deliberate, risk-weighted decision about which ones are worth spending an increasingly scarce interceptor on. Here are the operational numbers anchoring where this actually stands. 13 consecutive nights of American airstrikes preceding the current pause, more than 300 targets struck in the campaign's first 3 nights alone, and roughly 140 targets hit in a single peak evening. A 5-night pause, the longest quiet period this specific phase of the war has produced, broken by Tuesday's ballistic missile attack on Muwaffaq Salti Air Base. At least 3 missiles confirmed to have struck the base directly, despite CENTCOM's public claim that all of them were intercepted, a discrepancy that likely reflects the difference between missiles engaged and missiles that produced visible impact effects rather than a contradiction in the underlying reporting. American naval forces maintaining more than 20 warships across the region, enforcing the blockade against Iranian shipping, with CENTCOM reporting more than a dozen commercial vessels redirected, disabled, or boarded to ensure compliance in the days immediately preceding this attack. And a newly announced $2.4 billion American arms package to Gulf partners, with Saudi Arabia receiving the larger share and Kuwait receiving the remainder, timed to land in the middle of exactly this kind of sustained regional confrontation. This is where the 3 simultaneous pressure tracks converge, and the convergence explains why this specific attack landed with more weight than a routine exchange of fire would have. The military track is the strain on American air defense inventory itself, A genuine structural vulnerability that a 5-month war has exposed regardless of how confidently CENTCOM's public messaging frames each individual intercept. The diplomatic track is the collapsing credibility of every pause this war has produced so far. 5 different lulls now, by one count, each one ending the same way, with an Iranian strike landing at the exact moment negotiations appeared to be gaining traction, a pattern specific enough that it is no longer reasonable to treat each new pause as more likely to hold than the last one. And the economic track is the blockade grinding on in the background, regardless of what happens with strikes and pauses. More than a dozen vessels redirected or boarded in a matter of days, a naval presence that does not pause even when the air campaign does, continuing to squeeze Iran's economy on a timeline entirely separate from the on-again, off-again rhythm of the missile exchanges making headlines. Now go inside what this specific attack reveals about who inside Iran is actually driving these decisions, because the timing relative to the Trump-Netanyahu meeting is the detail worth sitting with longest. If Iran's civilian government and its foreign ministry genuinely believed the 5-night pause represented meaningful progress toward de-escalation, launching a ballistic missile attack at the exact moment the 2 leaders most invested in that pressure campaign were meeting in the Oval Office is an extraordinarily self-defeating way to protect that progress. The more consistent explanation, and the one this war's pattern keeps supporting, is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, operating through the same parallel command structure that has repeatedly bypassed Iran's civilian government throughout this conflict, is not coordinating its operational tempo with whatever diplomatic signals Tehran's negotiators are sending to Washington. Baghei's statement afterward, that what existed before Tuesday never technically qualified as a ceasefire, reads less like a negotiator explaining a genuine misunderstanding, and more like a foreign ministry spokesperson doing damage control for a military decision his own ministry did not make and cannot fully explain. The honest strategic assessment has to hold 2 things in tension. On one hand, CENTCOM's public record on intercepting Iranian missiles remains genuinely strong. Every threat aimed at Muwaffaq Salti on Tuesday was engaged, and the base's American personnel came through the attack without the kind of casualties the July 17th barrage produced. On the other hand, the reported depletion of Patriot and THAAD interceptor stocks is not a minor logistics footnote. It is a structural vulnerability that shapes every decision American commanders make about troop positioning, base defenses, and how aggressively to continue the kind of bunker-busting campaign that keeps triggering these Iranian retaliatory launches in the first place. A war that has run 5 months, 13 consecutive nights of strikes in its most recent phase alone, and repeated waves of Iranian ballistic missile fire against multiple Gulf states was always going to test the sustainability of American air defense stockpiles eventually. The open question is whether that test is now close enough to a genuine breaking point that it starts shaping American strategy directly, rather than remaining a background risk analysts only discuss in hedged, anonymously sourced reporting. There is a structural risk sitting underneath this entire trajectory that deserves to be named plainly. A defended perimeter that is quietly, deliberately letting some threats through because the alternative is running out of interceptors entirely, is a system operating closer to its actual limits than its public messaging admits, and systems operating that close to their limits are exactly the kind of systems where a single unlucky night, a slightly larger barrage, a slightly more sophisticated Iranian targeting solution, could produce a very different outcome than the clean, all-clear statements this war has trained audiences to expect after every attack so far. Every additional night this campaign continues at its current intensity draws that inventory down further, and unlike underground missile bunkers, which the United States has shown a clear and repeated ability to destroy through sustained bombing, American interceptor stockpiles cannot be replenished at anywhere near the speed they are currently being consumed. That mismatch, a campaign capable of destroying Iranian launch capacity faster than American factories can replace the interceptors needed to stop what does get launched, is the actual ceiling on how long this specific phase of the war can be sustained in its current form, regardless of how many more pauses, meetings, or diplomatic openings appear between now and whenever that ceiling gets tested directly. Go back to Tuesday afternoon, to the moment those missiles left Iranian soil aimed at a base that had gone 5 quiet nights without hearing anything like it. CENTCOM's statement closed the story publicly within minutes. All missiles intercepted, forces remain vigilant, exactly the reassurance this war has trained everyone to expect. But the quieter story sitting underneath that statement, an interceptor inventory stretched thin enough that some incoming threats are now being deliberately accepted rather than engaged, is the one that will actually determine what happens the next time Tehran decides a diplomatic meeting in Washington is the right moment to remind everyone the missiles never stopped being real. Whether that next moment arrives during another meeting, another pause, or another round of talks neither side has announced yet, the math behind America's shield over the Gulf is getting tighter every single night this goes on. And for now, that math is a story still being told anonymously in hedged quotes, rather than in the confident statements coming out of CENTCOM's own press office.